Today we are plunging into the murky waters of the US-Chinese relations, which have recently been marred by another controversy, this time over the South China Sea islands. What is the essence of the controversy? What are its bigger implications, and what is the rhetoric coming from both sides pointing to? We are discussing these and other issues with our guest speaker Evgeny Bazhanov, professor in international relations and the director of the Diplomatic Academy of the Foreign Ministry of the Russian Federation. And before we start the discussion, as usual, a brief reminder of what it is all about. On the 24th of July, a ceremony was held to mark the establishment of Sansha City on the Yunxin Island in China's southernmost province of Hainan. The Yunxin Island is part of the Xisha Islands in the South China Sea. This was followed by a U.S. State Department press statement expressing its concern over the increase in tensions in the South China Sea, directing its criticism towards China's recent efforts to safeguard its national interests. A quote from the statement: China's upgrading of the administrative level of Sansha City and establishment of a new military garrison there, covering disputed areas of the South China Sea, run counter to collaborative diplomatic efforts to resolve difference and risk further escalating tensions in the region. End quote. On Saturday, China voiced its strong dissatisfaction with the U.S. statement. The U.S. statement ignored the facts and sent a totally inaccurate signal, which is not conducive to the efforts being made to safeguard the peace and stability of the South China Sea and even the Asia-Pacific region, Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson Qin Gan said in a statement published Saturday. The war of words has been gaining momentum. News agencies have suddenly woken up quoting a commentary in the overseas edition of the People's Daily, the mouthpiece of the Communist Party, which used more colorful language, bluntly telling the United States to shut up on the issue. Another quote: the statement by the U.S. side confuses right and wrong, strongly misleads public opinion, sends the wrong signal, and it should be sternly refuted, it said. We can completely shout to the United States, shut up. Well, that looks like a strong-worded statement.
You know, what strikes me that several days passed after that exchange of opinions from the foreign ministries of the two countries, and then, unexpectedly, the party newspapers, People's Daily, Communist Party mouthpieces.
I also was, that might not have a bearing to that South China Sea issue, but, we all know that now the Chinese are leading in the unofficial competition of medals in the Olympic Games. And I was quite surprised when I was scanning the newswires today to see, a story which, to me, definitely lacks something like the Olympic spirit, because what the author was saying is that the Olympic champions from China have been deprived of their childhood. The happiness of their victory has been stolen from them by the unbearable conditions in which they have been training for years and years and years. Those kids selected to certain institutions, sport training institutions, are deprived of a chance to communicate with their families, to see their families.
I have a feeling
that sounds like a propaganda, just plain anti-Chinese propaganda.
They're hinting they are not human, but maybe those transformers.
Remember, there was another piece you were telling me about.
Yeah, in the Nature magazine, about a swimmer, Chinese swimmer, who won some gold medal. And then the Chinese protested, and the magazine had to apologize.
What did the magazine say?
I don't have it right now. But the meaning was that he's superhuman or something like this.
A product of gene engineering, or?
If he's superhuman, it means that he's not human. Something like this. The Chinese are...
They must have been enraged,
Yeah, sure. So, and in that story published by the Global Times, they say that, we have to get accustomed to that sort of China-bashing sentiment, because we are too successful and people don't like successful people, and nations don't like successful nations.
Burning Point.
We are talking about the US-Chinese relations and the recent controversy over the South China Sea islands. The interesting thing is that the main focus of the competition, it is still a competition, though it enters some quite dangerous waters, is the competition at seas.
Yes.
I believe that the United States have been rather appalled by the strategy, the long-term strategy of the Chinese government, which is looking at establishing dominance in the region, the maritime dominance. So is my understanding correct?
It is absolutely correct. The Chinese call it China's strategic direction at sea.
What is it? Do you think you could explain it to us?
Yes, strengthening Chinese Navy, establishing new cities on some small islands, and considering islands in the South China Sea, in East China Sea as belonging to China. I'd say that the Chinese are now sort of building a great wall, a great maritime wall of China. On those islands, the map, you'll see 7 dots. And there is so-called 7-dotted strategy. And those 7 dots, they sort of encircle South China Sea and other seas, which are very important for global maritime.
But, Yuri, it looks like the Navy is one of the soft points in the competition between China and the United States, because the Navy potential of the United States could not really be compared, even compared to that.
Katya,
of China.
So far it is.
Which means that the U.S. is taking preemptive steps to prevent China from developing such naval capacity.
Yes. And, Katya, there is a very interesting story published, by the way, in the same Global Times newspaper. It was written by a senior researcher at the Chinese Naval Research Institute. And he writes, I quote, "In recent years, the U.S. has increasingly pushed the return to Asia policy. The strategic nature of this policy still remains as suppressing and encircling China, but the prime goal is now maritime encirclement." Maritime encirclement.
So our guess was correct.
Yes. And, well, he cites several reasons for that, but the biggest reason, this researcher writes, is to put more emphasis on the sea, because more than 90% of China's foreign trade volume is conducted through sea passages. And the value of naval trade makes up to 2/3 of China's GDP.
Like we said, this is their soft point.
This is their soft point, and America is
definitely using its pressure on this. Yeah. Yes, absolutely. Which means that by exerting pressure on the Chinese maritime lines, they are creating a situation under which the foreign trade of China could be paralyzed.
Yes, and
so no wonder the Chinese are so upset.
Yes. Yes. The Chinese now feel that this encirclement of China is a long-term strategy by the U.S. You know that the Chinese don't have aircraft carriers so far.
Not yet.
Not yet. While the Americans have 11 aircraft carriers.
But the Chinese do have submarines, don't they?
They have nuclear submarines, they have conventional submarines, and they have ballistic missiles which are capable of striking at American aircraft carriers. But still, American military budget is 3 times bigger as the Chinese, and the Chinese Navy is less developed. But the speed of military build-up in China is even
exceptional. Absolutely exceptional.
So maybe the Americans are projecting what will happen in 10 years and in 20 years. Anyway, they've proclaimed this pivot to Asia, and now 60% of U.S. combat ships will be stationed in the Pacific instead of 50% just a year ago. So
the difference is huge, really.
The difference is huge, and, well, the Americans understand that their strength is declining while Chinese is on the rise.
Well,
but the Chinese, on the other hand, also have reasons to be, let's say, angry. Katya, angry. Those stories published in People's Daily and in Global Times show that somebody is angry in Beijing. Or
who could that be?
I think it's Politburo members. It's not just a person, but Politburo members who are now gathered in seaside city Beidahe.
Oh, it's a famous resort, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a famous resort, and it's tradition for the Politburo members to spend some time in unofficial meetings, discussions. And this time, those discussions precede the 18th Party Congress, which will take place in October. So actually, the Party Congress will simply stamp the decisions taken during unofficial or official meetings like those taking part in Beta He now.
Oh.
So I think that it took several days for the Politburo members to discuss the situation in South China Sea, and there is some sort of decision taken. And what we see now in those party-controlled papers is a manifestation of that reaction, that decision that will influence Chinese foreign policy not only this year, but maybe during the
coming 10 years.
The coming 10 years, because the new
term.
Secretary General of the Communist Party, by tradition, has 2 5-year terms.
Yes.
In office. So it is a very important situation, and maybe Americans misfired. They wanted maybe to influence the current situation around those small islands.
Are you saying that might have misfired by alienating the new Chinese leadership?
Yes, it will influence the new Chinese leadership.
Could that strengthen the position of the Chinese military?
Exactly. Not only the military, but also people from the military-industrial complex. And I think that what they are discussing now in this Beta He resort is also a composition of the next Politburo. In the present Politburo, there are 2 people from the army, representing army and navy, and 3 people representing military industry. Mm-hmm. So maybe in the next Politburo, there'll be more people.
On the main ground that there's been more than necessary tension coming from the United States. That could be seen as another argument in favor of the military.
They are strengthening, actually, the position of the military. I don't know whether they want it or not, but I have that feeling.
This is the Voice of Russia.
This is Burning Point, discussing the U.S.-Chinese relations. And now we are joined by our guest speaker, Evgeny Bazhanov, professor in international relations and the director of the Diplomatic Academy of the Foreign Ministry of the Russian Federation, giving us more details on the U.S.-Chinese relations.
If we go back to the late 70s and early 80s, when China and the U.S. were almost allies, or semi-allies, at least real strategic partners, vis-à-vis the Soviet Union. As we know, at that time, China and the Soviet Union were at odds, and China was looking for partners to deter the Soviet Union, and actually they called even for the United Front, calling on all countries of the world to unite against the Soviet Union. So at that time, when national security interests of these 2 big nations, China and the U.S., were very similar, very close, even at that time, they always had polemics, and there were issues in bilateral relations between China and the U.S. and in their attitude towards international issues where they clashed. And if we look at the newspapers of China and the United States of that period, we would see a lot of polemics, a lot of struggle, and that continued all the time. And recently, when China became, or is becoming a very strong power, a superpower. As we know, America doesn't like this, of course, phenomenon, and Americans try very hard somehow to stop this growth of China and its growth of its influence, its political might, economic might. It creates additional tensions between China and the U.S. And I'm not even saying now that they are not any longer as close strategically as they used to be in old times. I mean, if we look at national security interests of these 2 countries, they differ a lot, especially in recent time, because of this growth of the Chinese might, which is not controlled by the U.S., and Americans don't like it. And of course, the Chinese growth is not only in economy and its political influence, but also in its military might. And though China is still far behind the U.S. in its military might, but the gap is getting smaller. So, I mean, it's a tendency when this competition between these 2 powers continue to grow. And at times, because of specific issues, the polemics becomes very heated. So now it's one of these periods, because for China, islands in South Sea, that issue is very important, very touchy, and it's an issue which is hotly debated inside China, how to defend Chinese national interests, and when they see Americans interfere and try to work together with those countries in Southeast Asia which confront China on this islands issue, of course, for China it's something they don't like. And as I said, there is debates in China on this issue. Some people, mostly the civilian leaders, they tend to be cautious, and at the same time you have some people, especially military people, who are much more, I would say, aggressive in this sense, that they say that we should do something against American interference. So this issue is very big one for both for China and for the U.S., and so as a result they have these polemics. But it doesn't mean that because of these polemics, because of these harsh words that they exchange now, that overall relations between China and America will move into this a real confrontation, because both countries realize that they have many fields where they have to work together. It's first of all it's trade, it's investments, it's humanitarian ties, and issues in the international relations. Both countries understand that there are a lot of issues where they have to work together in the international arena.
Professor, but do we get it right that this time is rather critical for assessing the future of the relations between the two countries, because a series of Politburo consultations and meetings is now going on?
Well, yes, it's serious, but again, I say Chinese leaders are very responsible people. Chinese leaders of today, they are not old ideologues who looked at the world in two tones, red and black, or red and white. And they understand they need to continue modernization of China. They are preoccupied with internal issues. China has so many problems inside its own country. It has a huge population and many economic, ideological, ecological, ethnic problems inside their country, and they realize they have to concentrate on them. So, and of course, at the same time, they want to defend their national interests in the international arena, and they have to be more and more active, because China now is a global power. It has global economic interests, first of all, and you have to defend your economic interests. And of course, their political ambitions grow, and they want to have to support this economic and political interests with strengthening of their military machine, etc., etc. And they don't want to be passive. They don't want to ignore when they feel that the Chinese interests are in trouble, or when they feel they have to defend their national interests, they do it.
This is Burning Point, discussing the U.S.-Chinese relations. Just to remind you, we're speaking to Evgeny Bazhanov, the director of the Diplomatic Academy of the Foreign Ministry of the Russian Federation.
But at the same time, again, they do realize that because of internal preoccupations, because of common interest with America on many, many issues in international arena, and because these leaders are not, as I said, ideological fanatics, extremists, etc., etc., I don't think they'll allow relations with America to deteriorate to the end. And the same with America. I don't feel that. So this issue, again, is important. There are debates in China. Of course, there are people in China who are, I would say, even bellicose, but at least much more aggressive than others, who say that we should, strike back and we should be very tough with Americans. But I don't think this line will prevail completely, and that relations will be deteriorated. They're two interconnected, China and America, and leaders in both countries, again, they're not extremists, they're not fanatics. So, and of course, Russia is not interested in any confrontations in the world, much less in a confrontation between two leading powers of the world. So, from our point of view, it would be good if they come to more stable relations, and I do feel that after a while, these relations will come to a better situation. I mean, it is, again, if you look at the relations for 30 or 40 years, American-Chinese relations, that's all the way you had these ups and downs. And sometimes it looked like it's the end of the relations, then suddenly everything would stop. And actually it's, one of the methods of Chinese propaganda. When they're not happy with some country, especially when it comes to relations with America or Japan, if they're not happy, their propaganda becomes very strong against America and Japan, and they publish a lot of articles, make a lot of speeches on this subject, putting pressure on their partners or their opponent. But after they get a concession from that partner on this issue, particular issue, on some other issue as a compensation for toughness on this issue, the tone of propaganda can change very rapidly. And I witnessed these changes, very rapid changes, very real changes on many occasions. I remember, for example, they have good relations with Japan. Everything is okay. Then a problem arises, and Chinese propaganda becomes, very strong against Japan. Japan does the same against China. It looks like these two countries are going to have a war in a few months. And then suddenly everything stops. They exchange concessions, and again everything more or less smooth. And then again something happens. So I would say what we see now, it's just one of these ups and downs, and it's not a real fundamental change in Chinese foreign policy. Of course, it changes foreign policy of China with years. China becomes stronger and it becomes more ambitious, and it needs to have a more stronger foreign policy because of its global economic and political interests. But this change goes on gradually. It's not something, I don't think we should interpret these current events. It's something like a drastic change in the Chinese foreign policy in the coming months.
But this time I think it is not exactly the Chinese propaganda, it's rather the American informational pressure that we're witnessing.
Well, American propaganda always was, after Tiananmen events in 1989, American propaganda against China was never friendly. And especially in recent years, when China develops so fast, and especially its military component becomes much stronger than it used to be just a few years ago. I mean, American, I don't know how you call it, propaganda, policy of mass media in America, well, including, of course, propaganda, because it's also done by the State Department, statements and all this. It wasn't friendly, and it was quite strong. I mean, they criticize China on human rights issues all the time. It's been like this for decades, with no interruption. They criticize China for stealing secrets from the United States. They criticize China for having economic policy which is not correct, like dumping its goods into the American market, like holding Chinese currency at a very low level, etc., etc. So I don't see anything dramatically different in the approach of American media and American government's propaganda against China. I mean, State Department issued critical reports on Chinese human rights situation for years, criticizing China for not having enough democracy, for not having good policy. I mean, this birth control, strong birth control policy in China, which America disapproves, etc., etc. And when China and America were friends back in the 70s, Americans used to say that China was a perfect country as far as democracy was concerned. I worked in the U.S. at that time, and Americans used to say to me every day that, in the Soviet Union you don't have any democracy, people are not happy, people are suppressed, people never smile, things like this. And in China, it's a paradise. Everybody smiles, everybody is happy, and it was in the 70s when China had Cultural Revolution. And, for example, rector or president of the Beijing University was almost killed by students. They threw him out of the window, and things like this happened in China at that time every second, and the Americans didn't notice it. But now, when they've become competitors, opponents in national security sphere, in this overall growth, when China becomes, a strong competitor to the U.S., they've been criticizing China almost every day on hundreds of issues, including lack of democracy in China, lack of respect for human rights, despite the fact that human rights and observed in China now 20 times or maybe 100 times more than they were respected back in the 70s or 80s.
So thank you very much.